way to see Danny Goldberg, President of Atlantic Records and Vice President of Swan Song, Manager of Nirvana and Beastie Boys, among others. So this should be a fun time. This should be interesting. This guy knows everybody, has done everything. He can't really go much higher in the music business than this. So let's hear what he has to say. I'm excited. Are y'all excited? This is where I go to school.
Oh, it's a camera. I thought it was an energy drink.
Lucas that plays bass. But check it out. We're here to see Danny Goldberg. What do you know about him?
He's been with everybody, and he doesn't have STDs.
Yeah, I don't think you can go higher in this business than this guy's gone, you know?
No.
So, are you going to get signed tonight?
I wish.
You should,
I
dude.
will.
Your band totally fucking rocks. Right? So this is where we go to school, ACM at ECO. Woohoo! Well, this is a performance lab. Alright, so we're going to go in. Y'all come with us. This is Bricktown, by the way. Beautiful Bricktown, Oklahoma City. ACM at ECO. It's all lit up. Lots of people here. Opening the door. Okay, here we go. We're inside.
Welcome to our master class here with Mr. Danny Goldberg. Isn't this? I would talk about what he's done before we started, but there's no point because we're going to talk about everything he's done over the next 8 hours. So it won't be that long. You're worried now, aren't you? Yeah. So
yeah, I hate to talk about myself.
Well, is this your first time in Oklahoma City?
I believe it is.
Yeah. We went looking around a little bit today.
Yeah.
Had a nice lunch at 1492.
Yeah. Very good enchiladas.
So, went and saw the memorial. Okay, so you guys that have been here kind of know how it works. What we'll do, actually we're doing something a little bit different. You've got the flyers on your seats that tell you can send questions up here, and I'll see this here in a bit. I'll save it towards the end, and we'll run through kind of my questions with him first, talking about his career and kind of the path he's followed to get to where he's at now and everything, and then we'll go from there. So let's get started. So okay, one of the first things when people come here to the school, I always want to find out about their early education and whether music was part of that. Was that something? Was that tied to what you were learning in school?
I don't think it was a big part of my education. Now, I've been told to talk into the microphone, which means I'm not going to make as much eye contact.
That's fine. I'll be looking at you.
I'm not dissing you.
Yeah.
My parents had music in the house. They had a record player. They liked classical music and they liked folk music. Mr. Worthman, the music teacher at our high school, was kind of a nice guy, and I liked when he talked about Wagner. But, to me, it was really an exact moment almost when I fell in love with music. It had a lot to do with where I was in my life. I was between 10th and 11th grade, and feeling very, very isolated. And I heard some, kid at a camp sing Phil Oakes' song, Love Me, I'm a Liberal. And this was when the Vietnam War was just starting, and it just kind of blew my mind that somebody could articulate some of the things that were going on. And then I, in 11th grade, I discovered marijuana, Bob Dylan, the Stones, the Beatles, and the anti-war movement, and actually worked up the nerve to talk to girls all within about 3 weeks. I'm still so grateful to the fact that I was born at a time when that music was there, and long hair on guys, and football player to be cool, and I just somehow found a culture to fit into, and rock and roll in the late '60s was a huge part of that. And I was just one of those people that just couldn't, every dollar I could get, I bought albums with and fell in love with it. And so that was, I grew up around listening to music, but the passion I had for it was very much connected with my adolescence.
Right. So, would that have been the
And I had no
mid-60s?
musical talent. I mean, my parents tried to give me piano lessons. I just had terrible motor skills, so I never had any musical talent. I graduated from high school in 1967.
Right, okay.
So, the time I'm talking about, the year for me where I fell in love with music was 1965.
That was the year I was born. I like how they clap for that. Yes, that's important. But it does put it in perspective. I mean, everyone here does take, cultural history classes so that we understand correctly what kind of bands were going on in that era and what was happening. And it really was a different time. I mean, I'm often jealous of that. I mean, I thought back of like, man, if I could have been a teenager in the mid to late 60s, that would have just been a magic time.
It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I can't lie to you.
Well, okay, so where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a suburb of New York City called Hudson. I went to a high school that was in the Bronx called Fieldston. And one of the people who was in my class in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades was Gil Scott-Heron.
Oh, wow.
And it was, so it was an interesting time to go to school.
Right.
So it was a private school in New York City, but I was living in Westchester.
It's funny, I mean, reading your books, and actually I'll talk about this a bit more later, but I like this. I feel like the same things happened to me over the years, but even the title of your book, Bumping into Geniuses, I mean, there's this element with you, you're walking down the stairs of the venue and you pass Jimi Hendrix and say hi to him. You go into Albert Grossman's office.
I mean, he didn't talk to me. I just said hi to him.
I said, well, did he say hi back?
No, I think he looked at hi.
Yeah. He went, hi. Yeah. But, I mean, you see that kind of happen time and time again in your life and your career. And sometimes I'm curious, and this is more of an idea to talk about in a way. It's like, is that something that you helped happen? I mean, you were the one interested in music, so, by going to the venues where these people were and being interested in eventually working in that industry. I mean, I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. First, I want to talk about, were you a hippie? This is something I'm curious about. You kind of flirt with this in your book.
Well, I mean, hippie is one of those words. There's no membership card, It was invented by the media, and there was no real definition of it. But I would say what I would call hippie culture, I very much identified with. I was into the psychedelic culture. I had long hair. I was questioning authority. I was against the war. I like colorful things. I think the hippie culture is pretty cool. If anybody's curious about the hippies, one of the best documents of it, there was a movie made a few years ago, a documentary about Wavy Gravy, who's still alive. He lives in Northern California, called Saint Misbehavin'. And that, to me, it's very hard to capture what really the vibe was of hippies, because it was so corrupted by media and superficiality and commercialism, head shops, and suddenly it was a way of selling posters and black lights and not a spiritual or inner thing. But Wavy Gravy is a living, breathing hippie icon, and I recommend that documentary to anyone who's interested in hippies.
I think in your book, you mentioned a story about being at the airport. And you were trying to get on an airplane, and they wouldn't let you on.
Yeah, I just told this to my son the other day. It just blew his mind. I was was not a very good student in high school. I guess today they would have called me ADD, but they didn't. In those days, they just called it lazy underachiever. And
LUD.
Yeah. But you could get into the University of California at Berkeley just off of SAT scores, and I was a good test taker. There were no SAT tutors in those days, so I took it. So I went out there, and the first, I'm going to get to the question.
Yeah. No,
That's more interesting
this,
if I tell it this way.
Yeah.
And the first weekend I was there, it was like I got off the plane, And I had to find an apartment. A friend of mine from high school, we were going to share an apartment. We didn't want to live in dorms, you know, we were too cool for that, you know. And they let you rent an apartment in your freshman year there. So I got on the bus into San Francisco, and there's a guy sitting next to me on the bus. He has a mustache and kind of longish hair, so that meant he was cool. Because it was just, there was a moment where there was just a certain look that just defined if you were cool or not. Later on, people copied it, and people like Charles Manson came along and exploited it. But there was a moment of innocence where really anybody who looked like that, like. So I said, oh yeah, man, I gotta find a place. And he said, well, stay at my place, you know. So if this was happening 10 or 20 or 30 years later, you know, he's coming off here, he was just that was the thing. So I stayed on his floor for a few days till I found an apartment. And then the first weekend I think I was there, you know, this was a time when there was these concert halls in San Francisco that Bill Graham, the late Bill Graham, was running, and it was the beginning of what was called the San Francisco scene. It wasn't the beginning, it was maybe 2-3 years into it. And I saw Big Brother and the Holding Company, which was Janis Joplin's first group, and walking through the Winterland, which was the larger of these two venues, and held probably 2,500 people, but it seemed huge to me at the time, was this beautiful blonde-haired woman in diaphanous see-through white, you know, satin or some kind of gown, giving out free tablets of acid. Because Anthony Owsley, who later was associated with the Grateful Dead, who actually managed Blue Cheer, a long-forgotten but kind of awesome Bay Area metal band.
Summertime Blues, right?
Correct. They did a cover of They did a very loud fuzz tones cover of Summertime Blues. Would test market his products by giving them out there, and then oh yeah, the white tabs are great, you know, and then. So I never went to classes. I mean, that was it, you know, you guys who all have more education than me. And, because I never went to classes the second week. I went to 1 week's worth of classes. So then about 6 months later, I was in the airport trying to come home. I didn't tell my parents this, though. I was giving them some alternative narrative.
Wait, let me get this right. Yeah, so you were out hanging out with beautiful women taking acid, and you didn't tell your parents this?
No, I was not hanging out with beautiful women. I was staring at them. Hanging out took me a few more years of confidence.
Yeah, all right.
So one time I was in the airport to come home for, you know, I don't know, Christmas or spring break or whatever it was, because I still had this fiction that I was enrolled in college. And
fiction to yourself or to your parents?
To my parents.
Okay.
No, I knew I was.
Okay.
To them. And I was barefoot because I thought that was cool. And I went up to the counter and they said, listen, you know, you cannot get on the plane if you're barefoot. I said, why? You know, there's sanitary regulations about that, sir. So I said, you know, that just makes no rational sense. You know, the germs on a shoe are no different from the germs. Just listen, you're not going to win this argument. No shoes, you don't get on the plane. So I looked around the airport, and my eyes fell upon a cool guy, some guy, again, with long hair, and he just had that hippie look to him. And I walked up to him, and I said, listen, man, you're not going to believe this. They're not going to let me on the airplane without shoes. And, you know, I really want to see my parents. They bought the ticket and everything. I said, could you lend me your shoes, and I'll mail them back to you, you know? And he looked at me, and he said, sure.
Did they fit?
They did. They were these hush puppies, which I didn't particularly care for aesthetically, but they got me on the plane. And here's the terrible part of the story.
Oh,
I
no.
never sent them back the shoes.
Oh.
That's why the hippie thing failed. There was a lack of discipline and character to go with the vibe.
Is it because you lost the address?
I think I personally ruined the hippie vibe with that immoral act, and I'm still atoning for it.
The karmic fault right then. Well, okay, so you're heading back to New York, and you know, college was unlike all these
This
students.
is a great example.
I was about to say,
I'll try
unlike
this.
These people, yeah. You know, our wonderful students who love school, right?
Yeah.
It took you a second, but I'll take it. You know, it's okay because you didn't have what they have available to them. So, I mean, what was your did you even declare a major?
No, man. I didn't. I went to 1 week's worth of freshman classes. Like, I second week. You know, you're not really getting this.
It is hard for me to comprehend. Yeah, I mean.
So what happened is I got in trouble and I was scared straight. And you know, the advantage of doing that early is I also stopped doing drugs very early. I started early and I stopped very, very early. And I was back in New York, you know, a little after my 18th birthday, and I needed a job because I didn't want to, you know, I was going to some therapy, and of course you go to my poor parents. First they had to get me out of trouble, and then they send me to therapy, and the therapists tell you to blame everything on your parents. You know, so may they rest in peace, the greatest people, you know, but this was a tough time for them. So I wanted to get my own apartment, and so, you know, by the grace of God, it was a good time in the economy in the 60s. That is something that I really do appreciate, that I was lucky about, and that for my kids and for you guys, it is a tougher economy. But it was really, you just looked in the classified ads in the New York Times and circled stuff and went and applied for jobs, and I got offered one as a key punch operator for Sears Roebuck, which I guess I would have learned a lot about computers if I'd taken that one. And then there was a clerical job at Billboard, and it said magazine, and I just figured I'd been kind of a okay writer for my high school newspaper, and I always in my mind was a writer. I was always thinking, like I never wrote stuff down a lot, but I thought I was thinking about writing a lot. And
You saw words.
I was a big reader, and I felt magazine would be cool, and so I got that job. It was as a clerk, and I discovered right away that it was a magazine about this thing called the music business. And I didn't really know. In the ensuing decades, the music business has become part of the language of popular culture. There are movies where you see record companies, and there are managers, and you know, there's a mythology about it, and it's become known. But when I was a kid, I didn't even know there was a business. I just thought there were these artists and people who bought the records. It never occurred to me that there was this whole set of professions connected with it, and the idea that there was a weekly, actually in those days there were 3 weekly trade magazines just about the record business: Billboard, Record World, and Cashbox. Record World and Cashbox have since gone out of business, and Billboard still survives as sort of the international music trade. And it turned out my job was to call record stores. And there was this checklist of singles. The singles business was still a very important part of the music business then, and ask them if these singles were selling heavy, medium, light, or not at all. And they were described in either 3, 2, 1, or 0. And then to ask for their top 10 in terms of sales of albums, and then if they were a specialty store that had classical music at the top 10 classical, or if it was an R&B store or a country. And that was the data that then manually was added up and given to these guys that would close the door and make up the charts. After about 6 months, I got to sit in the room where the charts were made up, you know, and there was obviously a lot of favorite trading going on. But it thought it'd be based on some data, and that was the data. And you know, I did it for a few weeks, and it was just, you know, it was a job, and I got a paycheck, and I opened a savings account, and you know, it was again, I could pay the rent. After a month or so, I had enough to get a deposit, and you know, got my own apartment. I shared an apartment with a friend of mine in Brooklyn. This was before Brooklyn was trendy. So it was like, you know, whatever, we each paid $80 a month or something. And I discovered there were people on the other end of the office that got to go to concerts where they got in for free, and then they would write their opinions of the concerts. And I didn't have a lot of self-esteem because of the aforementioned thing of being kind of an underachiever academically, and you know, I got some drug problems up, but I knew I could do that. I could go to the Fillmore and write my opinion of, you know, some band, and so I kept saying, hey, you know, I'm a writer, you know.
Yeah.
And this is where, and you know, eventually they let me write some things, and you know, when people ask often in settings like this, you know, how to get into the business, and there's no answer to that, obviously, everybody gets into it differently, and the real answer to that question is any way that you can. But the way I got in was by writing about music, and it's an incredible thing because you have a byline.
Right.
And it's one of the few things you can do professionally at a very early stage where your name is attached to what you do.
You know, the other thing too, though, I think to note is that at least reading in your books, it seemed like you were one of the few people that was interested in writing about rock and roll and writing about the new long hair music and stuff like that that was on the Billboard staff and things. So you kind of filled a niche there that was...
Well, being young has disadvantages, but it definitely has advantages. And you know, the disadvantages are you don't have money and power and all that, but the advantage is that you're closer to the culture of young people than people that are older. And so in those days, my idea of an old person was somebody who was 30. And so it seemed to me like these were these very old guys that, you know, and it was all guys, you know, in those days who did this, who would go to these clubs and write about the older music. There was a club in New York called the Copacabana where like Smokey Robinson and the Miracles would play, and other kind of cabaret type artists, and the big reason those were covered assignments was because you got free drinks, free dinner, and that was the big thing, was to get the free drinks. There was kind of a cynical, hard-bitten attitude about it, and they would just write these generic reviews. I didn't care anything about getting free drinks and free dinner. I wanted to go to the Fillmore East and see rock and roll, see Jimi Hendrix, see Janis Joplin, see there were these bands that you guys probably know, Civil Way Brown Band, 10 years after, some of the people who later played Woodstock, those kind of bands. And some of the clubs, there were a few clubs in town. There's one called Steve Paul's, The Scene. Steve Paul just died a few months ago. It was, but The Scene was a legendary club in the West 40s where the Stones would go and hang out. Jimi Hendrix would jam, you know, every night when he wasn't touring. Literally would go there every night and jam when he wasn't touring. And I just wanted to go to those places. And these older guys were fine. You go to those shitholes. You know, we want to, you know, they want to get a steak dinner. So I was just lucky that what I was really excited about, the people that had more power than me were not excited about. And for example, the Woodstock Festival, nobody wanted to go. That's how I got to review the Woodstock Festival for Billboard, was there were all the people on staff like had no interest in schlepping up, and I was like, yeah. So I went up with the press agent in a limo to Woodstock, and
were people kind of like, when you were driving up in a limo, were they like, hey, what's the man doing here? Or was it, did they not care?
Well, I don't think anyone, I don't remember that. I mean, it was just a big traffic jam and stuff. But I felt that, you know, if you've seen the movie or heard about the Woodstock Festival, you know, it rained, and the people, and most people there were kind of sleeping outside, you know. It was the forerunner of festivals like, you know, Coachella or Bonnaroo or so on. And they were all muddy, because in those days people didn't know to have tents or anything like that. And I had a hotel room because I was press. So on the second day of the festival, when I showed up with this clean shirt, I got some funny looks from people who thought maybe I was like a narc or something. You know, and I say, no, I'm cool, you know, just have a hotel room. I just happen to have a hotel room.
Yeah. And then the next night you had 100 people in your room with you, right?
No, for some reason I didn't. I don't know, I was not that cool.
Okay. Well, okay, so you're writing for Billboard, and then what's the switch when you start writing? Did you write for Rolling Stone?
Well, I wanted to write, I mean, you know, I was a fan of rock writing, because I was a reader, and I was a fan of rock and roll, and there was this thing called, you know, rock criticism. It was really invented pretty much by a guy named Paul Williams. Paul Williams was in a bad traffic accident, and he's mentally impaired as a result, but he's still alive. He married the singer-songwriter Cindy Lee Berryhill, and I'm a Facebook friend with her, so she posts stuff about her as well. But he was a student at Swarthmore and started a mimeographed a magazine called Crawdaddy, and had these college students writing about rock and roll as it was art. And that was just a completely new thing. You know, movies had been treated as art for the previous 20 years. There were these French magazines, Cahiers de Cinema and stuff, where they wrote about popular movies, but it was art. And jazz and folk music and classical music had journals of opinion that treated it as art. You know, the famous folk periodical where people like Bob Dylan got early attention was called Sing Out. And there was another one. But rock and roll was considered, up until that moment, kind of this bastardized pop culture that was, you know, kind of one step above pornography and comic books. And, you know, smart people didn't like rock and roll. Rock and roll was for bikers and stupid guys with slick back hair. And, you know, there was, you know, and then, you know, as the years went by and the Beatles emerged, and the art form became more sophisticated, although it was pretty, in retrospect, pretty sophisticated in the 50s too. But this generation of kids came up who wanted to write about it, and Crawdaddy was where John Landau got his first job. John was a student at Brandeis, and he started writing, somehow met Paul and started writing for Crawdaddy, and out of that, John then goes to Rolling Stone, and out of that, John ends up managing and producing Bruce Springsteen till this very day. So, I was a fan of these magazines, so I'd read Crawdaddy, and the Village Voice had people that were writing about rock and roll that were really smart, and I felt they were like, you know, my peer intellectually, my kind of cooler than me, but you know, writing stuff that I was interested in. I wanted to be like them, because I knew I could never play an instrument or write a song or have any talent musically, but I felt I could. If you could get paid to like be a fan and write about it, that was just, I just thought that was like the ultimate great job to have, and I felt I had a plausible chance of doing. And Rolling Stone had come into being, I think in '67, and my entry into this world is '69. So now there's Rolling Stone, and that was like the most, very quickly the most influential, because it was really the first rock magazine that had mass circulation, because the Crawdaddy guy, Paul Williams, turned out to be a terrible businessman who didn't really understand anything. He was a writer, he wasn't really a publisher.
Right.
And Jan Wenner was a publisher, even at a very young age. He had this entrepreneurial understanding of business and raised money and made distribution deals. And he hired the Crawdaddy writers away from Crawdaddy. Johnny and the two most famous Crawdaddy writers were Paul Nelson, who died a few years ago, and John Landau. And so I just wanted to be one of those guys, and it took me a long time. I never really was particularly successful as a writer, but I had a goal. And it's another incredible advantage in building a career, besides getting your foot in any door that opens to it, is then to focus on a goal, because it's just, that doesn't mean you're going to achieve it, but the odds of achieving it are a lot greater if you're focused on something. And that was the one thing I could actually imagine myself doing at that time. And so I eventually got to know some of the other people that were writers. You'd go to the shows, you'd meet somebody else with a notebook, and you'd get to know them, and there was kind of a community of people that did that. And in those days, the record business was booming. You know, album sales were starting, and these were growth industries, so there were parties every night, you know, to promote records, and you could get free food at the parties, and, you know, and it became your social life once you were on that press list.
Right.
And that was kind of the pathway through which I entered the business.
So at 19, you're writing for Rolling Stone.
Well, I don't think I got my first Rolling. I never wrote that much for Rolling Stone. Again, this is, you know, as somebody who's been a self-promoter, I knew Rolling Stone was the apex. So finally, in the early '70s, a friend of mine became the record review editor of Rolling Stone. He assigned me to a few reviews. I think I wrote 4 or 5 reviews for Rolling Stone. But then I permanently put it in all my bios, which I wrote.
Yeah.
And has written, among others, for Rolling Stone.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I never was on staff at Rolling Stone. I wrote freelance several record reviews for Rolling Stone,
Right.
one of which was for the Edgar Winter Group, the album They Only Come Out at Night, and I was later given a gold album by the manager of the Edgar Winter Group, because it was the first good review they'd gotten in Rolling Stone, and it was the first gold record anyone ever handed me.
Wow.
But I really wasn't a Rolling Stone writer. I was somebody who wrote some reviews for Rolling Stone.
Well, that's still an accomplishment, at that age. And then you went on to, what about Circus? I mean, what were you doing for them exactly?
Well, there was this business happening of first the album business happened. You know, the record business had gone from being a business that primarily sold singles to selling albums. So that just made millions of dollars of income and created this culture. And then there's this business of media, selling fan media for people that were rock fans. Rolling Stone was the first, but not the only magazine to do it. There was this group of millions of fans of all these artists, the Beatles, the Stones at first, and then later on these San Francisco bands and the other rock bands that played the festivals and so on. And somewhere around, after I'd been around this scene for 2 or 3 years, I had developed a group of friends, like I said, that we kind of knew each other, and there was kind of a little cluster of 30 or 40 of us that reinforced each other's status by being friends with each other. And a friend of mine had been the editor of Circus, and he, for some reason, he wanted to quit Ronnie Finkelstein was his name, and I can't imagine why he quit this job, because he never got another job that was that great. But I think he wanted to work for a record company or something, and so he suggested me. And I had by then 2 or 3 years of writing freelance, you know, and written for the trades, and so I was managing editor of Circus for about 8 or 9 months. You know.
Right.
Circus was mainly distinguished compared to Rolling Stone by the fact that it had color pictures, because Rolling Stone, the first several years it was published, if you ever look at the archives of it, it was all black and white. So,
Right.
so Circus had, you know, just
I
the color.
remember
The
Circus.
writing wasn't as good, but the pictures were in color.
Yeah, yeah. So, but that's your age, 21, doing that.
Yeah.
So, I'm always interested in the path, and seeing kind of how one thing leads to another, because I think that's something, for everyone that's wanting to do anything, really. If you do have a goal, sometimes there's a path that's straight and linear, and then there's other paths that are a bit more curvy or whatever. So,
Well, I think one thing, and I was talking to one of your teachers when you were kind enough to show me around the school before, is, one of the other corollaries, besides kind of having some passion and having some skills, and I was an okay writer, I was a good enough writer for the low bar of these magazines, I never, is also trying to develop relationships with people, and trying to be a good friend to people and develop some relationships where you do something for somebody and they'll do something for you, and to be trusted. And there was a community of us that used to hang out. There was a club in the restaurant called Max's Kansas City where a lot of us would hang out with each other and get to know each other. And, if you can develop and work your way into a community of people, even if it doesn't pay directly, the payment comes in terms of those relationships, and there's no question that building some friendships we were all kind of living the same lifestyle. We were all young. We were all struggling to pay the rent. We all were seeing the same shows and knowing who was good and who sucked and who was a jerk at some record company and who was cool. And having that sense of community was vital for me in terms of those early years, because that's how I got opportunities, was through friends of mine that I really think that that's one of those things that is just as important as anything that's taught in a conventional academic context, is figuring out how to really be a reliable colleague and friend to people, because there are those moments where somebody says, who do you think would be good for this? And either you're going to be mentioned or you're not.
Right. No, I think that's a big part of it. I think the other side of it that you mentioned as well is, I talk about this a lot, is recognizing opportunities. I think so many people, opportunities go by them without them recognizing. And I feel like, just looking at what you've done, you've been able early in your life to recognize an opportunity and actually go through and make the step to try and do it. I mean, you could have easily have been like, well, I don't know if I could at 21, run Circus magazine, but you tried it, you did it,
Well, ignorance is bliss, I mean, to me, it felt more like just swinging at every pitch.
Yeah.
And missing a lot of them, but every once in a while the bat connected, and every once in a while the ball went the right direction.
But you try.
And I definitely into trying, trying stuff helps. But again, I think when you're starting, the other asset that you can bring besides being young is that you have more time to learn things, because people who are very busy are busy in whatever their job is, whether it's accounting or being a lawyer or an engineer or a programmer, and so they don't have time to read and listen all the time. Mm-hmm. And so one of the advantages younger people can have is they can be, so I used to, I knew all the names of the songwriters and producers of all the singles, because I was just looking at this information all the time, so it stuck in my head. Right. So there were certain older guys from the business who would then call me and say, gee, what's the B-side of such and such a record? And Seymour Stein, who we were talking about earlier, famously started that way. He started at Billboard with a similar job to mine 10 years earlier, and was known as the guy that had this photographic memory for all the minutiae of the credits on records. So that's the kind of thing that only a young person with a lot of time on their hands has time to digest.
Right.
And by having that expertise, you then have currency to get the attention of older people, who then can, over time, create opportunities, for you. So having time on your hands isn't a bad thing if you use it to learn stuff. And learning stuff, maybe just listening to 100 metal songs in a row and becoming the person who knows the most about, you know, Norwegian metal. But you got to use those idle hours to have some value to others, you know.
Right, no, I absolutely see that. So, okay, so, you know, from being a writer, then you kind of switched over to the other side and started working with publicity.
Yeah.
And, you know, do you want to, how did you make that move?
Well, the whole thing about me as a writer was that I was not very successful as a writer. I would have loved to have gotten a staff job at Rolling Stone. I didn't. I would have loved to have been the third stringer at the New York Times. I wasn't. I was not a very good writer. One thing was I was a little undisciplined and didn't rewrite enough. I sometimes read the pieces I wrote for Circus. There's a site called Rock's Back Pages for anyone who's a rock and roll freak, where this guy Barney Hoskins, a British journalist, has got the rights to thousands and thousands of old articles, and you can sign up for whatever it is, $10. I don't know how much it costs. But they have some of my old circus articles, and my articles were like, so I walked into the hotel room, and Hot Tuna was there, and they had just ordered room service. I mean, it was just a stream of consciousness, totally undisciplined. You know, so it's kind of fascinating for me as a document of my life, but it's not good journalism. And that's probably why the New York Times didn't offer me a job. But the other reason I was not a good rock writer was that to be the really successful rock writers were critics. Robert Christgau, John Landau, and you know, many others, Real Marcus. And I had an experience when I was first at Billboard where I wrote a review of a band called the Rascals. Well, I was a big fan of the Rascals in high school. They're kind of forgotten now, but they were kind of blue-eyed soul from New York, kind of an American attempt at doing what the Beatles did. And they had a series of big hits. One was called Good Lovin', one called People Gotta Be Free, I've Been Lonely Too Long. Fantastic singer called Felix Cavalieri. And they were a keyboard band, 2 keyboard players. And so I reviewed them, and this was the era of, and I think, well, to be taken seriously as a critic, I've got to say something negative. If you just write, oh, they were awesome, you know, then you're not going to be taken seriously as critics. So I'm saying how great they were. I said, but, you know, the guitar player, Gene Cornish, kind of twanged his guitar, you know, disinterestedly, or something like that, to show, hey, I'm a critic, you know. So then Billboard was published on Monday, and Monday afternoon the phone rings, and it's Gene Cornish on the phone. And he says, listen, man, I practiced the guitar for years. I don't twang the guitar. I'm really proud of that. It really hurt my feelings. How could you say that? And I felt so terrible that because it never occurred to me. I mean, I idolized these people. I bought records and seen their names, and this was a larger-than-life god to me. I was in a band that I liked. So I never wrote a bad word about an artist again after that, which also seriously diminished my credibility as a critic. So I failed, and I was out of work, and I stopped getting offered these freelance jobs, and I was, you know, running, and I was desperate for any income to pay the rent, and publicity was, in those days, to the writers, publicity was the ultimate sellout job and the defeat. And, you know, it was, oh, I'll never do publicity, and then it was like, oh my God, I wonder if I could get a publicity job. And through a friend of mine, you know, I was, got an interview with a PR firm called Salters and Roskin. Lee Salters was the big Broadway PR guy of the day. He died just a few years ago in his very late 90s. He had an incredible career, and he also was Frank Sinatra's PR person, Barbra Streisand's PR person. He was a legendary old school PR guy. And he wanted a young, long-haired guy who understood the rock thing, because there was this new business of doing PR for rock bands. And I got the job because, you know, I knew the rock writers, you know, and that was the, you know, and I went from being a mediocre rock journalist to being a really, really good rock publicist. Because that enthusiasm served me well as a publicist, even though it didn't serve me well. And I realized after being depressed that I was a failure as a writer, that I just read oh no, but I can do this other thing pretty well and feel good about myself. And you know, it was many decades before I started writing again.
Right. And that was when you started working with Led Zeppelin.
Well, I was at Salters and Roskin for a while, and there were all different clients that came in, and my job was just to try to do a good job publicizing whoever they gave me, whether it was sometimes it was a jazz artist like Stan Getz or Paul Anka or these people, but I was really into the idea of whatever it is. Now I'm 23, I'm not a kid anymore, and I'm gonna get a work ethic. You know, I don't want to ever be unemployed again. I hated that feeling of desperation and vulnerability I had when I needed the job. So I really was into this doing a good job thing, and you know, I was learning kind of the craftsmanship of PR from these great old school guys. And then about 4 or 5 months into it, Lee said, do we want Led Zeppelin as a client? They're looking for somebody. Are they big? I said, yeah, they're big. This was 1973, so Zeppelin had already been around for 4 years. The previous album was the one with Stairway to Heaven, so they were the biggest band in the world. So either way, you better come with me. I don't know this fucking music, you know. I'm the Guy Lombardo. So, you know, we were flown to Paris to meet Led Zeppelin and their manager, and because he was the name brand, big-time showbiz PR guy, and I was the young rock guy with him. And, you know, we had our meeting, and then after that, I was Led Zeppelin's PR guy. Lee never, again, wanted anything to do with him. He was horrified by the whole thing, and I was, and it was an amazing, but, you know, that was 1973, and I had entered this world in late '68. So, you know, it was 4.5 years of just trying a lot of different things, many of which didn't work, and eking out a living before that moment happened. And then working with Led Zeppelin gave me a halo effect that made me a kind of person in the business that to this day kind of is one of the things people ask me about.
Right.
But that didn't happen, you know, the first year I was, again, I was 4 or 5 years of scuffling around. So I was young, but the reason I was young is because I never went to college. It's not like I got right out of college and at 22 did this. It was instead of going to college, you know, I spent 4 or 5 years, you know, kind of working my way into the business.
Yeah, getting your 10,000 hours in that way, you know, to some degree. Was it Lee who told you to give the writer a good story? Was that where that came from?
Yes. You know, my original concept of publicity, and this is something that really is useful, I think, you know, what I thought my original job was to ask my friends for favors, because by this time I had, again, there was this community of New York rock writers. I knew them, and sometimes we dated each other, we knew each other, and, you know, supported each other. But you know, what I quickly realized is there's really a very limited number of favors you can get, because people have to have their own priorities, their own things. And what Lee's thing was it's not about favors. You know, he said you have to have a good story. You know, and he would spend every day, we'd have a meeting and think of how do you pitch things. And this was such a revelation to me, the idea of crafting a story. And he was just such a character. He had no problem making something up. You know, we had a band called the Moody Blues. So the Moody Blues, you know, hires the firm, and it's X thousands a month, and it's their client, and their promoter and American manager was Jerry Weintraub, who was this gigantic figure in show business. He later went on to produce a lot of movies, and it's actually a documentary about Jerry Weintraub, kind of a scary guy. Seemed like a mob type of a guy, but I don't think he really was. I think that was just his affect. But he famously promoted a lot of the Elvis shows. So we didn't want to let Jerry Weintraub down, and there was nothing interesting to say about the Moody Blues. They didn't have a new record out. They were not characters like the members of the Rolling Stones or Cream, or, you know, they didn't have these vivid personalities. And so I remember these meetings, and he says, well, let's do the Eastman School of Music thing. That always works. So what is that? He says, just to write a press release that they've been invited to lecture at the Eastman School of Music. They're a client of ours. They're in Rochester, so they like the publicity. And so I said, Lee, have you met the Moody Blues? They're completely inarticulate. They can't lecture anywhere. And he looked at me like, and he says, they're not going to do the lecture. He says, we're going to announce that they're doing the lecture. And sure enough, you know, it ran, and he came up with this idea of having a Broadway lyricist, this guy named Stephen Schwartz, who had written some lyrics for some Broadway shows, and he would review their songbook. So I ended up having to write his review of their songbook, but Stephen was delighted. He got publicity of it, and we got the New York Times, and miraculously enough printed this thing, because the anomaly of a Broadway. Now today, half of Broadway is rock songwriters. But in those days, that was a completely huge cultural chasm. So the idea of a Broadway songwriter acknowledging the artistic validity of a rock song's work was a novelty. So his thing was, you know, get a good. He had two rules. One is you got to get a good story. You got to give people a good story. Then you're not asking them for a favor. You're doing something for them. And the other thing was, if you write a press release, if they don't like the first paragraph, they're not going to read the second paragraph. And within the first paragraph, if they're not interested in the first sentence, they're not going to read the second sentence. And to this day, when people are in the office, they're writing a bio or a press release, it's always, what is the first sentence? Don't, you know, like that's worth a half hour of thought, because, you know, it's the portal through which you get people's attention. And I find that to be an incredibly valuable skill set in everything I've done, not just publicity, but
I was going to say, I mean, to me that feels like
business plans or.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like a key part of marketing is having a story for someone. I think that, you know, that applies to any record that I've ever worked with the Flaming Lips or whatever we're doing. We're usually not so focused on, hey, here's our album, here's our single. There's a focus more on what is the story we're telling here, what's exciting about what we're doing, and that tends to get people more involved in the same old story they hear time and time again. Here's the single, here's the album, here's the tour.
It's huge. And I think the artists that really have endured have an intuitive understanding of that. I mean, I saw Paul Simon years ago does an album in South Africa, and that's the story. Then he does one in Brazil. Then he, you know, a reunion of Simon and Garfunkel, you know, and Steve Earle, who I manage, is very conscious every time he does a record that he knows. When he does a record, he's also thinking about, first he thinks about the songs, then he thinks about recording it, then he thinks about what's the interview he's going to give. You know, and he, by the time he delivers a record to the label, he knows he's come up with a narrative, because, you know, he doesn't make records that have radio songs on them. So, you know, you need to get press attention, and the artists that have endured decade after decade have some understanding that that's a part of the art form of being successful. It's not part of the musical art form, but to be a public person. You know, the old movie actress Ruth Gordon once said that it's not enough in show business to have talent, you have to have a talent for having talent. And, you know, people like the Flaming Lips and Steve Earle and the Rolling Stones and these people that do it decade after decade also have a talent for having talent.
Right.
And how to communicate a narrative and a story so that what you're doing now is interesting, not just what you did in the past, is a key element in that.
So, what was Peter Grant like? I mean, obviously a legendary character, and you know, I would assume maybe by this time it was different, but at a point it seemed like the press didn't like Led Zeppelin, so when a bad review came out, did he like wrestle you to the ground and, you know, beat you up or anything, or was it, you know, just like, well, you tried, or how was it?
Well, Peter Grant was Led Zeppelin's manager, and he was a guy who previously, he was a very physically intimidating character. He was well over 300 pounds. And when he was a younger man, had literally been a professional wrestler in England. I think his name was Prince Mario Alassio, was his fake wrestler name. And then he was kind of a thug driver for Don Arden. Don Arden is dead now. He had a daughter named Sharon Arden, who became Sharon Osbourne, and is this big celebrity today, the Osbournes. And Don Arden was believed to be connected with British gangsters and was a much feared figure in the British music business, and there were stories about him holding people outside of windows, kind of like the stories you would hear about hip-hop in the 90s were told about British rock and roll in the 60s. And Peter had been his right-hand guy, enforcer guy, and then and really smart, very totally uneducated, Cockney, but incredibly street smart. And you know, wanted to be, you know, a manager himself, and along the way had become very close with Jimmy Page, and Jimmy Page and Peter kind of together created Led Zeppelin. Jimmy was the artistic genius, and Peter was the business genius. And Peter's role in the history of the rock and roll of the music business was that he was someone who was much feared, and was definitely somebody that personally, I'm sure, I never saw him hit anybody, but, you know, I'm sure he did, and he talked about having done so. And it was kind of this intimidating guy, but he was a huge advocate for artists and changed the economic relationship between artists and people they did business with. He wasn't perfect. He made some business mistakes, because again, it was a time when there wasn't the infrastructure of attorneys and accountants that were there to advise managers about really where all the money was. But when it came to concerts, you know, for decades, the deal that concert promoters would make with artists was 50-50. And Peter Grant, you know, after Zeppelin did a couple of tours, said, I want 90%. And everybody thought he was crazy, and he says, well, fine, then don't book Led Zeppelin. And literally overnight, the 90-10 deal was created. Now, I'm not saying that everybody gets 90%, but everybody who can easily sell out an arena can make that deal today, and that became kind of a standard. But that was his understanding of the power of the artist, that the people were going to come and see Led Zeppelin, and if they didn't want to go to Madison Square Garden, they'd come and see him in Nassau Coliseum an hour away, or in New Jersey, or in Connecticut, but that the artist had that power. And he was he wasn't the only one. Bob Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman, had started some of that in terms of artistic power and not letting record companies tell artists how long a song was going to be. I mean, you know, again, there was decades where record companies were these authoritarian creatures, and there's a few people that came along that changed all that and recognized that the power relationship had changed. And Peter was certainly one of them. And you cannot find a British manager who had artists in the 70s or 80s who doesn't admire and give credit to Peter Grant for having made their jobs easier in terms of changing that power dynamic. But it was also a time, you know, I worked for Zeppelin in the mid-70s from 73 through 76 when a lot of cocaine around. It's hard to imagine how prevalent cocaine was, not just in the music business, but in society. People on Wall Street, people in the White House, famously, you know, I think Hamilton Jordan got supposedly caught with cocaine. He was the chief of staff for President Carter. It was just not considered dangerous, which was wrong. It's horrible for you. But there was a few years where the culture hadn't caught on to the damages of it. It was almost collectively, you know, the Western world was on a cocaine high. And Zeppelin was at the epicenter of that. They were the biggest rock band in the world, and you know, it brought out some terrible behavior. He could be irrational and difficult. You know, and he was, you know, again, very intimidating, just even sitting next to him in a limo. I mean, he was 300 pounds, so the car took a right turn. Being crushed by this giant, you know, and you kind of felt he was doing it on purpose to let you know that he could crush you anytime he wanted to. But the truth is, he was pretty good to me. They liked me. They had, as you mentioned, been ridiculed and dismissed by the rock writers. There's actually the current issue of Rolling Stone, Jimmy Page is on it. Right. And he does an interview in it. I just read it a couple of nights ago. Pretty good interview if anyone's interested in Led Zeppelin. It's one
Is anyone interested in Led Zeppelin?
It's one of the more revelatory interviews. Jimmy was never been somebody who was very good at doing interviews or he was shy kind of guy. So there's not a million Jimmy Page interviews the way there are with some other of these artists. And this is one of the better ones I've ever read. He talks about, you know, them getting bad reviews in the early years and how it upset him. There was a phenomenon that I felt was going on, which was that the people like Landau and these rock writers I was describing to you earlier were all in their early 20s when they were first writing about rock and roll in 67, 68, 69. And then Zeppelin kind of come along and really hit it big in 1970. And so the difference between 67 and 1970, you know, 3 years when you're young is a long time. Yeah. And so I remember people in Max's, you know, these group of critics saying, oh man, Zeppelin, I mean, their audiences are so young, you know, it's like, because it was like suddenly, you know, that they had 13 and 14-year-old fans and that they were just a few years removed from the Rolling Stones, that there was this, you know, you could be old at 25 if you don't keep your mind fresh.
Right.
You know, there's a huge difference between being 16 and being 25. And so a lot of these people in Rolling Stone and all that stuff were kind of trapped in what they thought was cool when they were in high school 5 or 6 years earlier. And we're looking down on the music that this new generation of high schoolers was loving, and Led Zeppelin was one of them. When I eventually did press for Led Zeppelin, Robert Hilburn was the music editor of the Los Angeles Times, and I was really grappling with the fact that all these critics hated the Zeppelin, you know, and Robert Hilburn is just one of the most greatest guys to ever come along, and a pure soul. There's not a snobbish bone in his body, and has this tremendous curiosity. He retired a few years ago from writing for the Times, but he still writes. He wrote a pretty good book, something Cornflakes with John Lennon, I think it's called, you know, about his memories. And so he had this, so he bought into my idea that this is a younger audience and that these current critics don't get it. So he hired a high school kid to interview Led Zeppelin for the LA Times based on this, you know, because I was trying to get, my whole pitch to the press was, you may hate them, but they're big. This was my great story. It's what I can come up with. They're big, so you ignore them at your peril, because they were literally selling out stadiums, 50,000 people a night. Jimmy talks about it in his interview, you know, and so so he hired a high school kid who's been sending him articles, and that kid, who was then 15, was Cameron Crowe.
Right.
And it wasn't the first article Cameron wrote, but it was one of the first. And it was a few years later, when Rolling Stone wanted to do a cover story, the band by this time was so mad at Rolling Stone for the mean reviews they'd gotten that they turned them down in '73. But in '75, I said to Jimmy, I said, look, you turned them down in '73, so it's cool. We turned down Rolling Stone. Now maybe, how about saying yes to Rolling Stone? Because Jan Wenner, the publisher and owner of Rolling Stone, was saying, look, you can pick the writer, you could. We'll do Q&A if you want, so there can't be any snarky criticism in it. So I said, so Jimmy said, all right. I said, well, I said, do you have any idea about who the writer should be? And he said, let's get that Cameron Crowe.
Wow.
You know, he said, because he knew he had him. You know, he was a fan.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, in the movie Almost Famous, you know, Cameron depicts the character based on him as being this artistically pure, I've got to write the truth. But actually, as a journalist, Cameron was into writing these suck-up puff pieces. Right. And it was not at all intimidating to the artist. You felt safe when he was doing the story. He turned out to be a great screenwriter and director. I had no idea he had this other depth, and I'm a big fan of his movies. But he was not that difficult guy.
Wasn't that where the "I'm a Golden God" came from? That whole.
Yeah, Robert used to say that in interviews sometimes. I saw him say it once. You know, he was looking out of there were these balconies on Sunset Boulevard, and Robert Plant just loved being a rock star. He loved being the lead singer of Led Zeppelin. He had these long, flowing locks, and he enjoyed being Robert Plant.
Do you think
he said that once? Yeah.
We'll see any more Led Zeppelin shows?
I mean, I don't have any inside information on it. It's been a long time since I was an insider with Led Zeppelin, but my personal opinion is probably not. Because the power dynamic in that band shifted. You know, when it started, Jimmy Page is 5 or 6 years older than Robert Plant. So when Zeppelin started, Jimmy Page was like 29 or 30. He was a very, very respected guitar player in the British music scene. He played on, he was a hugely successful and influential studio musician who played on The Who, The Kinks, all sorts of big records, and he'd been in the Yardbirds. And Robert was this kid just out of high school. Robert was 17 or 18, and Jimmy picked him, and John Bonham were the two young ones, and him and John Paul Jones were the older ones with the track records. And Jimmy completely controlled the band, made all the decisions, produced the records. Peter was his hand-picked manager, and him and Peter kind of made all the business decisions. And, you know, what happened after a few years is Robert started to realize, you know, I'm the lead singer, you know, and, like, I'm getting, you know, the girls like me as much as Jimmy, and I'm, like, getting as much applause, and I'm recognized as much, but he was not as empowered, so I think he resented that, and then when the band broke up, of course, you know, Robert Plant can go and sing Stairway to Heaven without Jimmy Page, and it still sounds kind of like Led Zeppelin. Jimmy Page without Robert Plant, lead singers, you know, have a particular value. That doesn't mean other artists, you know, you know, I managed Tom Morello, who's a guitar player who's got a signature sound. Eddie Van Halen has a signature sound. I think Jimmy Page has a signature sound, but not like the lead singer. And Robert has been able to be very, very successful without Led Zeppelin. He won the Grammy for Album of the Year, the album he did with Alison Krauss. He's got plenty of money, and I just don't think he wants to do it. And in this interview, in the current Rolling Stone, Jimmy says that, you know, yeah, Robert just doesn't want to do it. I guess it's not going to happen. So Jimmy Page probably knows better than I do. He says it's not going to happen. Right. But, you know, if Robert changes his mind, the other guys will be there the next
Were
night.
you at the reunion show?
I did go to the reunion show. I think it was in 2007. The guy that was then working with Jimmy was kind enough to get me tickets, and I went out with one of my clients, Pele from the Hives, who'd never seen the band. And it was fun to be there. It was like a high school reunion. It was. I'm really glad I went. And there's this movie that was made of that show called Celebration Day that came out a month or so ago. I'm sure it'll make the rounds. It's pretty good. It's just. It documents that concert. There's no interviews, there's no backstage, but it's very well shot, and you can see the chemistry between these guys. And it's pretty interesting. You know, John Bonham was the great, legendary drummer of Led Zeppelin, and you know, many people consider to be the greatest, including me, consider to be the greatest rock drummer ever. Died young. He, one of these guys, terrible drunk, and choked on his own vomit at the age of 30 or something. And that's when the band broke up, because he was so much part of their sound. They just couldn't be Led Zeppelin, they felt, without John Bonham. Or I should say Robert felt. Because, you know, when the Who lost their drummer, they just got a new drummer.
Right.
But, so Jason Bonham was John Bonham's son, and he plays drums. He played drums at the reunion show. And you realize this guy, who's now, I guess, 40 probably, or well into his 30s, you know, balding, no kid anymore, but was always kind of a really, really good drummer. I remember Bonzo talking about how proud he was of his son, what a good drummer his son was going to be. And his son is a really, really good drummer. He's nowhere near as innovative as John Bonham was, but he can copy what John Bonham did. And he'd grown up with this music his whole life, and one night of his life he got to look out and see what his father saw, which was Led Zeppelin fans responding to a Led Zeppelin show. And you can see the other members of Led Zeppelin getting off on sharing this with him.
Right.
And playing a very, very good show. I mean, these are older guys. It's not the same as in their 20s, but Jimmy played great, and it's a nice document of a moment. It's not the greatest thing ever done, but it's quite good.
Right. That's great. Well, you know, there was a switch here from working the press side of things to where you became part of the record label side of things. Wasn't it when you started working at Swan Song? Would that be your first record label type job?
Yeah. I was a publicist, and then Zeppelin started Swan Song. And Peter Grant flew me over to England and said, you know, Jimmy and I would like you to be our ambassador in the U.S., you know. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, you know, what you do, you know, do the press, talk to Atlantic. So they had a label called Swan Song Records. It was not really a standalone label. It was an imprint that said Swan Song, and Led Zeppelin made an additional percentage of money from the records on Swan Song. And they had a budget where they could sign a certain number of artists to Swan Song. This was considered to be the mark of a rock superstar, because the Beatles had a label called Apple Records, and the Rolling Stones had Rolling Stone Records, and Jefferson Airplane had Grunt Records, so Zeppelin wanted more.
That's a vanity label. Right?
That's how you knew you were a rock star. But Peter Grant, they wanted to make it more success. They had this thing, we're going to do it better. And so they did do it better, because they signed better artists. And they signed, they signed one other artist that was huge, which was Bad Company, whose first album went to #1. So I was working for Swan Song Records. I just made up this title, Vice President of Swan Song Records. I mean, there was like 3 people on the staff, so it wasn't like, huge, but it sounded good and looked good on a business card, and Peter didn't care. He was in London, I was in New York, and there was a lawyer named Steve Weiss who was really the senior guy, but he didn't take a title. He was just Zeppelin's lawyer and administered the company. And so I got to deal with the other departments of a record company on behalf of Led Zeppelin. I met radio promotion people, and I met the sales people, and I met people in the art department, and some of the distribution people. And so that was my entry into the innards of a record company.
Yeah, learning how the rest of it worked, really, because you probably wouldn't have been really privy to that knowledge, in a sense, just from the from the publicity side.
No, definitely not. You know? No, people who were just writers, and you had no idea the other elements.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something interesting. You know, the difference between a manager and someone who works at a record label, unless you're at a higher position. Most people at record labels really just only know their job.
Correct.
You know, and the manager and perhaps the product manager at a record label or whatever they call it, but Warner's, they always call them product managers. So the few people that really understand how all the various aspects worked. And I think it's interesting that you coming through the publicity side, you have this great knowledge of that, and then working on Swan Song, you learn another whole thing. there's so much more you've done. We've already got an hour here, and I want to talk about a bunch of other things. But there was one thing you mentioned in the book about Maggie Bell versus Bad Company, and you had this line in there. It says that the public creates stars, and I thought that was an important thing to bring up tonight too. Just the idea that you had great publicity and a great amount of record label support for Maggie Bell, but it was Bad Company that happened just because of the public, you know.
Yeah, they had a hit song. Maggie Bell's a Scottish singer. She'd been in a band called Stone the Crows, and the great talent of that band was also a guitar player named Les Harvey, who was her husband. And he was on stage in northern England, and lightning struck and killed him. And he was electrocuted on stage. You know, today they have ways of dealing with this, but this was, again, the electric music on a stage during a rainstorm was a relatively new thing. And so she was like a widow, and now and Peter Grant had managed on the Crows, so he wanted Maggie Bell to be the first artist on Swan Song. And she was a great blues singer, not a real writer, and didn't have a fully developed artistic identity, because her greatness was really in the context of being in that band with this other guy who is now dead. But she still sang great, so they decided, well, she's still a great singer, so we'll make her career. So they got Jerry Wexler to produce her record. Jerry Wexler was legendary forever. He produced all of Aretha Franklin's biggest records. He was the one who had originally signed Led Zeppelin and was one of the owners. He was the minority owner, but a partner in Atlantic Records. So that was a huge thing to get Jerry Wexler as a producer. And then they got the biggest booking agent. Booking agents are the people, you know, who arrange to get you onto concerts. And in those days, Premier Talent was the most powerful booking agent in rock and roll. The guy who founded it, Frank Barcelona, died last week.
I saw that.
You know, but in those days, he was like the godfather of touring. And so she got on every good tour. You know, people always ask, how do I get on a good tour? And it's always like, I don't know, it's hard. You got to get lucky. But in those days, the way you got on a good tour was get Frank Barcelona to be your agent. He would just insist, you know. So she did just hundreds of shows. You know, the press loved her because they were looking for a female singer then. You know, Janis Joplin was dead, and there was just this feeling there should be some female big rock singer. And so I got very lucky with the press. I just nailed it out, and, you know, just Newsweek, Time, and New York Times, everybody just raved about her because they were kind of, it sort of fit the need of the media for that narrative, and it made me look like I was this great press agent. But you know, it didn't sell. It just, and in retrospect, I totally get why it didn't sell. It was not really an original record. It wasn't a fully developed. Later on, you have something like Chrissie Hynde come along with the Pretenders. You have Patti Smith. You have these amazing artists who filled the place in the culture that was left when Janis Joplin died. But Maggie Bell just couldn't do it. Bad Company comes out about 8 months later with less of an effort. Peter liked them. The lead singer, Paul Rodgers, had been in a band called Free, and Mick Rouse had been in Mott the Hoople, so it was kind of a mini supergroup, and it was, you know, good. But there was much less clout used on behalf of Bad Company. But they had this song called "Can't Get Enough of Your Love" that, like, it was played once on a radio station. People started calling it was one of those magic songs, like this big rap song that's guy Sigh now, or, you know, or last summer you know, Call Me Maybe. It was like the rock version of that. It was like boom, you know. And so their album went to #1, and the single was #1, even though the amount of influence that was used on their behalf was maybe 1/10. It turns out the public can't get enough of your love, and they heard Maggie Bell and said, you know, just how it goes, you know. So yeah, the public creates the stars, but they have to know about an artist. So the job of the business is to get the public to hear the music. All of us, managers, record companies, booking agents, publicists, marketing people, bloggers, you know, all we can do is get people to hear the music. Then it's between the audience and the music.
Exactly.
But getting people to hear it is no small thing.
Right.
And it gives people a chance. People used to, oh yeah, you just spend a lot of money to get on the radio and then make someone a star. I said, no, you can get it on the radio with a lot of money. But whether or not people like it or not, a whole different thing.
Right.
A lot of things go on the radio and are not hits.
Right.
But if you're not on the radio and you're not visible on iTunes and you're not playing Coachella and you're not written about, then no one will get to hear you, and so that's the other extreme. And you know, we saw this. I don't know if anyone of you saw the movie Searching for Sugar Man. You know, the movie about
yeah, I don't think it's played here, or maybe it played at the museum. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm very interested in that. Although I've
pretty
heard
cool.
might not be entirely real. Like, I don't know. I'm curious about it.
I think it's real.
Yeah.
From what I know. And this was a guy that was, you know, on a shitty label in the 70s and never got a chance. It becomes a star in South Africa because somehow the record took off virally there. And 20 years later, they find him and he becomes a star. And then this documentary came out, and now he's like all over the world. He's 70, and he's bigger at 70 than he was at 30. And because he didn't get a chance. So there are examples of people who just don't get a chance, but there's a lot of people who get a chance and then the public rejects them. So you need both.
Yeah.
But what we do is expose the music to the public, and then it's between the artist and the public. We can't make the public like it. We can just make them hear it.
Right. Exactly. Well, I want to talk about there's so many things, but your activism and you know, this is such a big part of what you've done within the industry. And first, I'm curious about, do you feel like, well, what was the first thing you feel like was your first kind of political or activist thing that you did within the music industry?
Yeah. Well, again, just to step back, when I was in high school, also, again, it was, the Vietnam War was raging and the Civil Rights Movement, you know, I was 18 when Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were killed. I was 13 when John Kennedy was killed. So my childhood and the way my parents were, what then was called liberals, you know, and you know, my experience of falling in love with rock and roll and developing these political views happened at the same time in my life. And you know, the Woodstock Festival, I just heard Carlos Santana talk about this in one of those Michelle Clark things where we met, or re-met, you know,
right.
The Woodstock Festival had a political element to it. It was 3 days of music and peace was not just a neutral feel-good word. It meant end the war in Vietnam. And so, you know, in the back of my mind, that was always kind of part of what got me into the thing. But there was no outlet for it for years. I was just trying to build a career, pay my rent, get ahead, get people to take me seriously. And then when I was about, in around 78, I had a PR company. This was after I left Zeppelin. I had a little PR company. I had some clients. And a guy named John Hall became a client of mine. John had been the guitar player and writer in a band called Orleans, which had 2 hits, Still the One and Dance With Me. You'll hear them both sometimes in TV commercials or movies about the 70s. And the Orleans never became a big band, but you know, they were a pretty good band. They were like a jam band of their time. And he became obsessed with the environmental and health hazards of nuclear power. He'd been a physics major in college, and he lived in upstate New York near Woodstock in a town called Saugerties, where they were going to build a nuclear power plant, and he freaked out and tried to organize artists to be against nuclear power because of the feeling that the nuclear waste could not be contained safely, and if it was loosened in the environment, it was a tremendous carcinogenic, cancer-causing thing. Obviously, there are a lot of people in Japan who agree with this. But this was 1978. And then the next year, so he did this press conference I did for him with Bonnie Raitt and Carly Simon, James Taylor, and him, you know, artists against the nuclear power. And then like the next year, there was an accident at a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania in a town called 3 Mile Island. And this was 79, and it was like the biggest news story in the country for that month. You know, the nuclear accident, and would there be a meltdown, and would they have to evacuate whole sections of Pennsylvania? And it turned out that they didn't have to evacuate whole sections of Pennsylvania. Later on in Russia, there was this horrible accident in a town called Chernobyl, where the whole town was decimated. So it became a big thing, and they decided to do concerts in Madison Square Garden. So they did 5 nights at Madison Square Garden. They were all sold out. I think Madison Square Garden held 19,000 people, and there was an outdoor rally in Battery Square Park where 250,000 people came. And John was the catalyst for it, but because he wasn't a big star, he reached out to Jackson Browne, who would become interested in the issue because he was interested in Native American culture, and there were Native American leaders in I forget whether it was South Dakota, who didn't want the Black Hills to be mined for uranium, which was the fuel of nuclear reactors. So the environmental movement there connected with this idea of the waste, two different reasons to be against nuclear power. And Jackson Browne was a big star at the time. He himself could sell out 20,000 night arenas. And he got 20 different artists, and most notably Bruce Springsteen is a young up-and-coming artist, headlined the last 2 nights. And the Doobie Brothers, believe it or not, were big enough then to headline the other 3. And Presley, Sills, and Nash got together. And somehow or other, I had this idea to make a movie of it and was able to talk Jackson Browne into it. We made a movie called No Nukes. And it came out in 1980, and it, got a nice article in Rolling Stone. It's a documentary. It's not, wasn't a big hit, but it had a cult following. And we did a screening of it in LA. I remember the movie studio in 1980 to try to work for some of the artists and to get press interest and all that. And Jerry Brown came. Jerry Brown was then the governor of California. Bizarrely enough, Jerry Brown now is the governor of California. So I'm not the only older guy who's had a long career. He's even older and his career is even longer. But then he was the young governor of California. Now he's the old governor.
Wasn't he like dating Linda Ronstadt?
He was dating Linda Ronstadt.
Yeah, I remember that being a big thing.
And I would look and I said, and Jerry Brown was a possible president. He had run in the primaries against Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination and beat him in several primaries. He ended up not prevailing, but he was a plausible president in the future, one of the leading lights. And I looked at him in the audience, and I was such a student of politics, and oh my God, rock and roll can do something that would get like Jerry Brown interested? Like, and it just had this epiphany for me that rock and roll had an ability, and it's really music and art writ large, but I was obsessed with rock and roll part of it, to create energy in a society that from time to time could resonate in political issues. And that sort of, overnight I redefined myself to myself as sort of a music business guy and an activist, because I had this experience doing something that was kind of a political message in the context of a concert. So ever since then, I just, if you want to, people sometimes say, gee, how do you get involved with politics? So, you answer the phone, man. I mean, any of these organizations, I'm sure you get thousands of these calls if it's environment or women's organizations, gay rights, or, all sorts of other causes, not to mention all the people who run for office. Not so much people who run for office in Oklahoma, but,
They're a little scared of rock and roll here, but it's okay.
But we have a little different politics in New York and California where I've lived. But
just slightly.
But they want show business people to help them raise money to get them publicity. So if you let it be known that you're receptive to such phone calls, you get them. And I let them. So I've been getting those calls for the last 30 years, and sometimes I can help out.
Right. So, okay, you did No Nukes, and then you met Bonnie Raitt through that. Was she one of your first management clients? I was curious about that.
She my very first management client was in the late 70s, a band called Mink DeVille, which was kind of a hybrid. They came up in the era with Elvis Costello and some of the so-called new wave artists, but they were from New York, and he was really influenced by R&B. He loved the Drifters, but he wore these skinny ties, and he was a character, great artist who unfortunately had a bad drug problem, and he died about 10 years ago. But that kind of got my feet wet as a manager, and then I had another management company called Gold Mountain, and Bonnie was one of my first clients at Gold Mountain. She was not the first. The first client of Gold Mountain was Belinda Carlisle.
Oh, right.
The lead singer of the Go-Go's, and went solo, and she had a #1 record, and that I was Belinda Carlisle's manager. People returned my calls for a minute. And but Bonnie I had met through No Nukes, and I just revered Bonnie Raitt. I'd been a fan of hers before I met her. She's just an incredible singer, incredible guitar player, a brilliant person. She's a Harvard graduate. Just super funny and smart, and was going through a tough time in her career. She was in her late 30s. She was dropped by Warner Brothers. I managed her, and immediately Warner Brothers dropped her. And it was like she'd finished her record, so we had to go, and Mo says, please, just put out the record so she could tour. Okay, but we're not going to promote her. I can do anything. It's the last record. So we got her through that, and we got her opening to some shows for the Grateful Dead, which turned out to be very helpful for her because those audiences were really receptive to who the opening act was and actually expanded her live business. And she, cleaned up her act and lost weight and wrote this song called Nick of Time, and we were able to make a deal for her, and she ended up having a gigantic second career. Her second career was much bigger than her first career.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
She went from selling 60,000 records to selling 4 million records, and I was lucky enough to be there at that time. So she was one of my early clients at Gold Mountain, and the success of that record was transformational in terms of my reputation as a manager, because it was being involved with somebody who was down.
It was
a huge,
multi-million.
famous comeback story, and she won all the Grammys in whatever it was, 87 or 88.
I think it's interesting that
she
said,
thanked me on TV.